If you watched any courtroom dramas, you'll know that attorneys file briefs for the judge to read. It reduces a lot of information into what is called essential argumentative elements of the case. The judge doesn't have time to read all the information, but needs to get a quick understanding of what the arguments are. Then, if necessary, the attorneys will provide additional information or clarification upon request. A similar procedure occurs in academic debate. A brief, then, reduces a lot of information into an outline of essential argumentative elements of the proposition. This video lecture focuses on defining a brief, specifically within the context of a formal academic debate, which we kind of just did, and then goes into detail on the brief format for the first affirmative constructive speech. In a future video lecture, we will go into some general briefs that can be used by both the affirmative and the negative. For the purpose of this video lecture, we will use the terms affirmative to refer to the team or the debater advocating a change in the status quo, and negative to refer to the team or the debater opposing a change and supporting the status quo. One final caveat. For those of you who may have competitive academic debate experience, or who will have that experience in the future, please know that this is a very basic brief, set up using a problem-solution approach. Your intercollegiate debate coach may have you design your briefs differently. So we've already addressed the definition of a brief. Let's turn next into what goes into a brief, and in particular, the brief for the first affirmative constructive speech. Regardless of the type, a brief will include the arguments or claims you plan to make, backed up by the evidence that you plan to cite to support those arguments. Also, regardless of the type, a debate brief is usually prepared in outline form, using a version of the standard outlining numbering convention. In an academic debate, it is often read in outline form, actually verbalizing the outline numbering conventions as in contention 1, subpoint A, etc., and plank 1, plank 2, etc. While you will likely prepare multiple briefs, the only brief that I can guarantee you will read in an academic debate is the one covering the first affirmative constructive speech, because that is the one that sets the parameters for the debate. It identifies the resolution, or area of controversy, establishes the reason the controversy exists by identifying what's wrong in the status quo, and in policy debate, offers a solution or a plan to fix those problems identified. The affirmative case is broken up into 3 to 4 sections. First is what I'll call the front matter, which orients the opponents and the critics to the issue under discussion. This includes an introduction, a statement of the resolution or the topic being debated, and observations such as defining key terms that will be relevant in the debate. The first major section is the case, which is the reason the affirmative believes there needs to be a change in what we are doing now. There is a problem or a harm that is significant, or a big harm, that is inherent in the status quo. If we don't make a change, this problem will still occur and may get worse. The second major section is the plan, which identifies what the affirmative believes will solve the problem. Ideally, the affirmative should offer some assurances that their plan indeed will work, which is solvency. This includes identifying the advantages of adopting the plan, namely, showing that the plan will actually solve the problems identified in the case. The affirmative may also want to show that their plan is workable or feasible. If your plan was to reduce overpopulation by colonizing the moon, you would likely have to show that the technology is available to do that. Here is the format of the debate brief for the first affirmative constructive speech. Again, note that the case is written and spoken in outline form, including all of the evidence supporting the claims with the full source citations. You'll start out with a very brief introduction, written out word for word, followed by the resolution. Then you'll address any observations that apply to the overall case. Usually this includes any definitions. For example, what exactly do we mean by capital punishment? But it can include other items, such as establishing a criteria, perhaps whichever solution, the affirmative plan or the status quo, that provides the most benefits for the least amount of costs should win the debate. You'll recall that the first affirmative speech needs to develop a case, which is the reason we need to change the status quo, and provide a plan to make that change. After the observations, the affirmative will contend that there is a problem with the status quo that must be fixed, building the case. These arguments are called contentions, and include establishing that there is a harm with what is happening now in the status quo or the present system, as well as inherency, that the status quo or the current system is causing the harm or at least is allowing the harm to occur. In other words, if the affirmative doesn't fix the problem, it's bad, will continue, and will very likely get worse. Now remember that the case is the reason that we need a plan. So that leads us to the plan portion of the affirmative brief. In a policy debate, the plan is spelled out. In debates on fact and value, however, there may be an implied plan. While in the case part of the brief, the affirmative contends that there is a harm, identifying each main argument as a contention, in the plan, the main parts of the plan are called planks. These planks address the agency, who will administer or oversee the plan. In an academic policy debate, this is usually a governmental agency, either one that exists or that the affirmative team has created. Think of what happened after 9/11, the bombing of the World Trade Center. As part of the plan to solve the problem of terrorism, a new agency, Homeland Security, was created to administer and implement various rules and regulations. That leads us to a second plank, mandates, which explains what the affirmative plan will do. Again, think about how the U.S. is trying to reduce or eliminate harms related to terrorism. Airport security might show up under mandates. Now, these mandates need to be fairly specific. You can't just say, we will increase airport security. You would have to identify specifically how you would do that. And you'll also need to identify how you will make sure that the rules are followed or the mandates are followed, as well as what happens if the rules are broken. This is the enforcement plank of the plan. And nothing is free, and you will always need people to do some work. This relates to the funding and staffing plank of the plan. In the case of airport security, it costs money to pay the people who do the security checks, as well as money to pay for the equipment. You'll need to identify where that money will come from and what qualifications the people who do the security checks will need. Usually, that's all the plan is: agency, mandates, enforcement, and funding and staffing. But occasionally you feel you need to add something else. If that's the case, you can add a fifth plank called addendums, which tells us anything else we may need to know about the plan in order to understand how it will work. At the very basic level, this is what the affirmative needs to meet its burden of providing a prima facie case. There is a problem that is bad enough that we need to change the status quo, the case, and a solution is provided to solve that problem, the plan. However, it would be nice to provide solvency, often worded as advantages. The main advantage of adopting the affirmative plan would be that it would solve the problem that the affirmative identified earlier in the case. But there could also be additional advantages. This is a stretch, but in the case of increasing airport security, passengers may start packing lighter, which could reduce fuel costs, which could result in lower fares, an advantage that has nothing to do with reducing the presence of terrorism on a plane. This type of additional advantage is called a subsidiary advantage. Finally, you'll end with a brief conclusion, requesting the critics to vote affirmative on the debate. Processing time. How would you define a brief? What are the basic elements of the brief for the first affirmative constructive speech? And what is the terminology used for the main points in the affirmative case and the affirmative plan? You should now feel more confident about preparing a brief for your own first affirmative constructive speech, as you now know what that brief should look like and sound like.